Hello, and welcome to the VtES podcast, where we talk about all things related to Vampire the Eternal Struggle, the card game. In this series, as you are aware, we look at common archetypes in the game of VtES. Before we start the video, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that if you like the video, do give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. And if you want to support the channel directly, you can do so over at Patreon at www.patreon.com/swakuoz. Also, do take the opportunity after this video, or you can pause it now if you want, to go check out the other videos in the series, or indeed any of the other videos on the channel. Alright, and without any further ado, today's guest is the Prince of Singapore, our resident favorite necromancer, lover of all things undead, especially zombies, the one, the only zombie boy, Keith. Hello, Keith.
Hey, hi, Keith here.
Hey, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, so what are we going to talk about today?
Well, it seems that our topic is one that is very dear to my heart, and that is allies as an archetype in VtES.
Wait,
so
we're not going to be talking about imbued, are we?
No, that's forbidden. We don't talk about this.
Yeah, so
if we talk about imbued, I think we're going to have to just kill you.
Yeah, I'm going to get the horse's head at the foot of my bed or something.
Yep.
So
I can imagine the hate in the comments already.
Hey, it's engagement, right? So what is it about ally decks that that appeal to you so much?
Well, I have to say that what I really love about ally decks is, number one, there is a lot of minions, and I kind of feel that ally decks kind of scale upwards in the mid-end of the game, whereas a typical deck would tend to kind of power down and run low on resources. But when I play an ally deck, I don't seem to feel that. I kind of feel that once I set up, I'm in a position to probably slowly steamroll all my plays.
So maybe let's take this opportunity to clearly define what an ally deck is for the viewers at home. I would assume that by its very definition, an ally deck would have a lot of allies.
Of course.
And also, I would also assume that you pack a lot of cards that support those allies.
Yep, naturally.
Any other things that you think sort of defines an ally deck?
Well, I'd say that if you were to talk about ally deck, there will be a couple of key cards that we always see, one of which I'm asking. That's one of the key cards you will see. So things like the Special Affairs, Vision, cards that kind of support allies without needing a discipline or a sect or plan. Also cards like Target Vitals, KRCG, Channel 10. So I think you would tend to see these cards in ally decks. Since allies don't have access to disciplines like vampires, they would tend to rely more on cards that don't require any disciplines or clan or sect requirements.
And I think, so that's kind of true regardless of what sort of ally deck you end up building, or what sort of ally deck appears on the table, right?
Pretty much. And I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point. Of course, there are variations in ally decks, but you'll see some common cards throughout all of them.
Nice. So, what, in your opinion, is other than things that you've mentioned before, like scaling and having a lot of, I guess, slightly more resistant minions, probably. What other strengths generally would an ally deck have?
Well, I would say that one of the main strengths is, of course, that allies are immune to effects of a number of cards in the game. Take, for example, let's say, aim. You can't place aim in ally. Flash grenades, vision, so it can't be stolen by vision. Or even the abilities of certain vampires. So, yeah, it already gives you an inbuilt inherent advantage that some of these things that target vampires don't affect allies. And adding on to that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, they tend to be decks that have a lot of minions. So action economy is normally not a problem. You tend to have enough actions to overwhelm the prey and the grand prey and so on, assuming that the allies don't die. But if they do die, it's not the end of the world. You can lose one, or lose one, or even one war blue, and you can still be in the game. So I would say that they are more expendable than vampires.
So in that sense, yeah, basically because you're, at the end of the day, because your vampires can always just bring out more allies, or even allies can just bring out more allies. And then of course things like Emerald Legionnaire. Yeah, they're it's not quite as bad to lost an ally, and it's also typically not very easy to for vampire-based decks to deal with allies.
I mean, in the first place, you can put allies into play quite reliably, generally. Also, allies can then go on to do that. And it's unless you have access to like practically consistent effect, it can be hard to block on an ally deck. That's notwithstanding that they will usually have some kind of stealth through that.
Yeah, because a lot of allies as well come built in with stealth. So cards like Double Deuce from one of the latest sets.
Double Deuce. Benefit T. They're really good cards actually.
Yeah, and there are also ally effects that basically skip the whole action, interaction. This things like Vagabond Mystic. It gives lives to another ally, but it's not an action. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank beyond that, but I'm quite sure you have more. You're easily able to come up with more examples.
I mean, when you talk about like allies, one other thing which I would say is that you can also kind of reliably block effects that have low or no stealth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, and especially with the help of your master locations like Channel 10, KRCG, it can actually get pretty difficult to get past a wall of allies unless you are able to generate stealth very, very consistently. Because eventually, somehow, with like one intercept and your master, they will catch you. This can be a problem if you're bleeding an ally deck, and that's one of the reasons why I like playing allies. And not to mention that many allies are pretty inherently dangerous in combat. So quite a number of them actually have an inbuilt ability to combat. Say, for example, Sunny Hordes, Ogul. If these actually get into combat with you, it can be pretty nasty, pretty fast. So kind of gives you kind of table influence. So just by being on the table.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you also would run cards like Target Vitals, like you mentioned before, and there are a significant, I would think, number of combat cards that are disciplineless and without clan requirements that allies can play, and it's not quite as straightforward. It's not like you look at, say, a Alton, for example, right? He can strike for 1 range damage, but if the deck is built around allies and then by extension around Carlton, you probably wouldn't be able to, you know, comfortably say, oh, if I run into Carlton, you'll be fine because, you know, it's just one range damage or it's just a dodge. I can deal with it. Because all of a sudden it might be, you know, one range damage plus target vitals, and there's always there's always concealed weapon as well, right?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the very commonly used rules is flash grenade. Allies can't be affected by the effects of the flash grenade, so you just go ahead and toss it at vampires and kind of deny them their next unlock phase.
It's like a negative majesty.
Yeah, and you know, and in fact, it covers majesty as well. So even better.
That's right. It gets around majesty.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair to the poor vampire playing majesty, they do get to unlock for about 2 seconds, which is nice.
I guess that's when you kind of laugh at your opponent and you're like, But yeah, I mean, when we talk about cards that allies can use, and you know, we don't even have to talk about like clan-based ally decks or discipline-based ally decks. Like you mentioned, Carlton, or for example, let's say like Austrian. You know, you can put Austrian into any deck, and all you need is like one trap. Suddenly, he turns into a monster table. So you can totally change the dynamics of one ally. So what more if you want ally?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Jake Washington, Concealed Weapon, Saturday Night Special, Dragon Breath rounds is a thing.
Yeah, for the low cost of this one pool.
So yeah, I can see where allies are inherently dangerous in combat. I think it's also a bit of psychological sort of on table gameplay, right? Because vampires, other than a handful, generally only have one strength, whereas an ally has, and the other thing as well is it's actually literally printed on the card itself, because the vampire would just be like, you know, by default it's one strength, it's not shown on the card. But when you look at an ally and it's like, 2 strength. Okay, 2 strength is, you know, after you play a villain somewhere and then you realize, oh, my vampire, you know, my 8-cat vampire now only has 3 blood. Do I want to take 2? Because taking 1 is fine, but, you know.
Yeah, and that kind of, it's really a big jump between 1 and 2.
And this also kind of ties back to what we about slightly earlier, where allies are immune to a lot of cards that only specifically target vampires, and one of it is Taste of VtES. So yes, your combat monster vampire can hit really hard, might be able to, I don't know, say take out Ocean in one punch, you know, in one combat, but at the same time you're taking that 2 back, and unless you're playing damage prevention somehow, you're relying on Taste of VtES is no longer enough. Punching an ally for, you punch a Warghoul for 5. Sure, that takes the Warghoul out, unless my math is wrong. Was it 6? Anyway, you get what I mean, right? And then you can't taste it back, so the Warghoul punches you back for 4, and now you can't do it again. You can't just go after the next Warghoul because that's 8 that you can't get back. Not the usual way anyway. You have to hunt and then, cards like Unmasking, Intercept Locations, all that, the play like you mentioned before. So yeah, I can see allies being trickier than vampires to get into combat and deal with.
Yeah, and it's always the incidental actions that catch you unaware. Like, yeah, if you are ready with stuff in hand to push through your actions, probably they can't catch you. But it's always the little things like hunting, or just like getting an equipment, something like that, and then suddenly they catch you unaware, so you don't have to stop. And that's how they get you.
Yeah, I still have not so good memories of a courier on the juiced up courier with a tonside, swinging a tonside post, beating up a vampire. Like, oh, I'm empty, I have to hunt. I was like, oh, hang on, there's this courier, this little guy on a bike, and then there's like signposts and target vitals, and like, wait, what's going on here?
But yeah, I mean, it kind of leads into our point that once set up, an ally deck can be pretty tough to face, and it does mean that there are some downsides to playing allies too. It's not all good and roses.
Yeah.
So like yeah.
Like, this now's a good time as any to segue into the weaknesses of an ally deck.
Yep. So, being immune to the effects of certain cards, but it can also be a thing. Like, for example, you can't play things from ally, so you can't easily recoup blood or cool from an ally. You could raise the blood off.
Sorry, which card is this?
Brave.
Ah, Brave.
You see?
Yes, I know that card. Yes.
But yeah, I mean, most weak cards don't work with allies either, except on the TV. And that comes also with outside that ally doesn't unlock.
Yeah, and I learned recently playing Abomination, the card itself, that allies can't play Abomination. So even though you need an ally in order to play Abomination, because you're turning a werewolf into a vampire, you can't have like OCN and double deuce hanging out, and OCN turns double deuce into an Abomination. You still need the vampire.
Well, that's cute. Also, quite ties into the lore, isn't it? Like,
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I think one of the biggest main downsides of allies is that there's no inbuilt way for them to return once they're burned. And unlike vampires, they don't go to top; they are burned. And there's no inbuilt way for an ally to come back to the table except no Legionnaire. Emerald Legionnaire laughs at me.
Yeah. Oh my god, the elephant in the room.
Yeah. The subject of many discussions.
Yeah. Well,
but
I mean, if just heads up, if this sounds, if you watch this video sometime down the road and Emerald Legionnaire has been errata somehow, or is fallen out of favor in the meta, as of the recording of this video, Emerald Legionnaire is the latest and hottest tech, and it's winning tournaments everywhere. So yeah, the price of cheese on the internet every time an Emerald Legionnaire deck shows up. So a bit of context into why it's the elephant in the room and why we keep coming back to sneakily mention it.
I mean, when you can just bolt on an Emerald Legionnaire module onto a random deck and works, that's quite something. Quite something.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but I mean, it's also, I guess, it's something rare, but I think it's also a testament of the design of allies within VtES, where it's not just Emerald Legionnaire that works as an ally deck, right? It clearly, I mean, should get you on Shell Games one day to just play an ally deck, just to show what we're sort of talking about. Because I think a lot of our viewers as well, especially those who are watching this, just as it comes up in with whatever's been happening recently around tournaments in VtES, it might be a case where there are a lot of our viewers who are like, oh yeah, ally decks you're probably just talking about Emerald Legionnaires. But I think this might be a good opportunity for me to just clarify that two things. So one, there are ally decks out there that is not Emerald Legionnaire that can be successful, and B, Eve has been doing this way before Emerald Legionnaire was ever a thing.
yeah, I mean, I had to say, if I were to count the number of copies of the masking that I have, I think I have a lot of Archetypes.
I think at one point you had all the masking in your local meta.
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. But yeah, I mean, like what you said, there are many types of ally decks and that have done well in tournaments and won tournaments. And this is going back since like just kind of started. So like Shaman Courts come to mind, Nocturnes, Couriers, Wargools, Panoramias. There are plenty that actually work just fine. And Emerald Visionary is not the be all.
Yeah.
Oh, the Thunders, how can you forget?
Oh yes.
I think probably the previous Boogeyman before Emerald Visionary.
That's true. That is true. Yeah. This is an interesting enough sort of side topic that we should maybe come back to it in a little bit. But I guess I've led us off into a tangent, and maybe we should come back and look at the what are the weaknesses the allies deck have. And I noticed that you put down here that allies can't play cards that require disciplines.
Yes, and it's something that I mentioned previously, but it's worth highlighting since it can be quite a big downside to playing allies. Without access to them most of the time, you're stuck relying on cards like you mentioned. Don't require anything like other vitals, dodge, take out. Having said that, there are a couple of ways to give disciplines to your allies, but that's a whole new kind of worms. You actually have to build the deck around that. So not as straightforward as it appears. Also, one more quite valid point is that cards which steal allies are much more common in the game.
Yeah, I remember at one point I can't remember which vampire was off the top of my head, but it was Ventru, and I added her into the sort of gentleman with sticks kind of Ventru archetype deck, just because there were I mean, I'm not naming names here, but I think for some reason there were enough allies going around in the local metagame that I just wanted to bring a permanent, a non-transient sort of way to steal allies. And the other one I think as well is it Zapper, the leper king,
yes.
leper something.
Yeah, the Balai guy, right?
Yeah, I've seen him a few times as well. Like his ability is relevant even without the entire ally thing. It is this kind of sort of effects, right, where it's incidental. They do the one thing that the deck actually wants to do, and then also incidentally steal allies. So it's not like, you know, people have to specifically tech against allies, although I would kind of expect more people to do so in the next few upcoming tournaments. But yeah, it's because the effects that steal the vampires tend to be specific as well to, okay, this card, that's what this card does, or that's what this effect does, it steals a vampire. And would you say that's, yeah, that's like a sort of feeds into this weakness?
Pretty much, yeah. And and it can be incidental, but huge swing in the game. Like for example, you steal a wall, steal an escape notification. Suddenly, that's a huge table threat that you have. I've lost. So it's a big swing. Yeah. But I think it's not the only weakness. So we've covered a couple, but I think if you look at the recent range of precons that Faction 3 has come up with, quite a big focus on blood sorcery combat. That's actually one of the really big weaknesses of Dice, which is blood theft abilities in combat. So, you know, if you were to face, let's say, Fear or Manu Hakim, play a theft of VtES, that's your Thunder's just gone. And it doesn't do damage, bypasses your damage prevention, your damage negation. Yes, you can dodge it, otherwise it's gone. Straight away, that's like 2 pull done. So I think, especially if you're playing in newer play groups that have or like only access to the newer cards, you might see a bit more blood sorcery combat in your local meta. And then you have to be really careful what your allies do.
One of the weaknesses of allies as well, and I think you touched on this briefly when talking about like if somebody steals your war ghoul, it's a huge swing away from you and benefit to the other person. But also at the same time, it's also the investment that you put into the ally pool or blood cost, and you've just lost that, right? Because and I think this sort of brings up 2 things. One is the loss of investment, and the other as well is it kind of ties back to the strength of the ally deck, where you can go really wide, but at the same time you also have to be aware that this pool cost and the blood cost will add up, whether through a single ally like the Remnants of the Endless Storm, which costs us 5 or 6 pool, or even with allies like Procurer, which is 2 blood. The first Procurer is fine, and then the second, and then the third, and then at some point you're like, oh, this is getting expensive.
Yeah, and it's not only the expense of the ally, but it's the action cost. It actually takes time to set up an ally deck when you're ready to lunge and take out your prey and grand prey and so on. And the pool, maybe you can cover the pool. Can't get the actions back.
Yeah.
Really impacts your game. So if you were to use, let's say, like something of the Endless Storm or a pool, even 3 pool, big loss, and it's also an action loss. So this is one more weakness of the ally deck, which is that you actually need time to get it up and running. And during this time is when the deck is most vulnerable. And you have to rely on other forms of defense. For example, let's say deep bounce, be able to weather the storm until you're ready to block predator's actions with your allies, or go forward really fast and punch and kill your prey.
So I guess the biggest mitigating factor to this needing time to set up sort of is the way you would run an ally deck, right? You know the strengths, you know the weaknesses, and you have to tailor your gameplay to deal with this, to maximize your strengths and deal with these weaknesses, especially the one that you just mentioned, where you require time to set up. So in your experience, what sort of typical sort of strategy or gameplay would you recommend if someone were to want to try out an ally deck?
Well, there are many ways to skin a cat, but generally most of them tend to follow the same pattern. If your deck has a certain key vampire, still need vampires, even though they're not part of it. They're not the main thing of the deck. So you have to bring out the key vampires first. Vampires that have a discount on allies, for example, or they have very good stealth. If, for example, they are able to do good actions without being blocked. So you would always try to bring up these key vampires, followed by any auxiliary vampires to support. First, you have to bring out your vampires, then you start to put allies into play. So whatever it could be, courier, shining force, whatever. Bring them out. Five while bringing them out, either by creating bleeds from your predator, or using cards like delay tactics, boats, or covering your pool using normal means, villains, dolls, and so on. And you have to actually reach a certain critical mass, say, Shadow Hordes or 4 players, or the fun die, before you can reliably go forward and actually assuming that the allies are the main focus. Because there could, of course, be variations. For example, like nocturnes. I would say that nocturnes can be the front and center basis of an automation deck, but they can also easily be bolted onto any sort of deck that uses it. So in which case that they are kind of auxiliary to your game plan, but not the main. So once you actually bring out your allies and you actually oust your first prey, you should be in a position to, with the pool that you do, then move on and steamroll the table, oust your grand prey, and so on. Just defend against the attacks of the predator, knowing that you'll take some damage, but as long as you don't die in the game and your allies are alive, basically once you have enough allies, bring out critical mass, let's say, whatever that you need to oust it. So that's when you push forward, cover 6 pool by ousting your prey. Should be quite safe if your allies are still alive. You push forward and get your grand prey, so on, to earn the game win.
What are some of the things, I guess, you should probably take note of when you're thinking of running an ally deck, or or you've already brought an ally deck to the table? You know your strategy. You kind of know what you're going to do, and I guess it's more like tactics, like what you do based on things that you notice, I guess. So what in your experience are some of the things that are potentially dangerous to an ally deck, and when you're playing it, these are things that you need to look out for?
Well, you mentioned like in the game, but I would think even before the game starts, there's also a consideration. Know your local meta. Actually quite an important point, because as I kind of touched on earlier, if you blood source combat can be pretty bad for your allies. Also things like celerity gun decks, or any deck that burn or steal allies with any celerity. So if you know that you're facing a lot of these things in your meta, you have to be kind of a bit careful how you go. And the table seating is pretty important too. Unfortunately, you can't control that. But yeah, if your predator is blood sorcery combat, maybe it's not so bad. But if you're bleeding blood sorcery combat and they can block you, that's going to be a problem. So that's more of the meta point I want to bring up. But in game, there are also things that you really have to look out for. For example, cards that damage burn pool equal to the number of minions that you have. For example, Anarchy Subrising, Empowerment. I know that I've been by these many times. Something like, I think the most I've ever lost is like 10 pool from like Insular Empowerment.
Ouch.
Yeah. So be sure to pack delaying tactics in your deck if you don't have votes. And usually the majority of ally decks don't have many votes, because usually the vampires tend to be on the smaller side in general. So you might want to bring delaying tactics, really essential. As we also said, events like FBI's division, the unmasking, these are essential for gameplay allies. But I think my most important piece of advice would be lead the table state. So, like, especially in the early game, when you're trying to set up the ally deck, kind of get a feel for whether your prey or predator is going to be either very aggressive or very inclined to block your action. So, like, for example, if you know that your predator is going to block your action ally, try and convince him and say that, oh, I needed to go forward and beat my prey. If you block it, can't go forward, it's going to be harder to kill your prey later. Make this kind of argument with him. And likewise, if your prey is the one who's going to block, say, oh, the ally is for defense, I need to block the predator, you don't want me to die too fast, right? So these are kind of little tactics you can employ in game. Try and get other players to let you recruit your allies without any interference. Barring that, if let's say that you have someone who is very aggressive, leading you very heavily, and you have allies that can rush, for example, Wogu, Shining Boss, Mental Patience, use that leverage. Tell them like, oh, I would rush you if you don't beat me. So we have a deal, we can always talk about it next time again. We can renew this deal. And I've had games where I've won by simply holding my predator at bay that way because they were too scared to advance and beat up by my ally. So I think these are the kind of the main points that you really have to read the table, keep a low profile in the early game, and try not to be too oppressive that the whole table ends up being. Because I know that it's quite common that when people see, when the table sees that you have like minions, they start to kind of act a bit irrationally and tag up on you sometimes. So you have to be prepared to either make deals where you can, or sometimes you really just have to be able to go it alone. Pack some backup plans, fallback plans in the deck, be able to recover pool, be able to bounce bleeds, for example, or to stop both by delaying tactics from other means. Yeah, I think these will be the main points when you play a guy like that.
And I think you mentioned before, these are sort of like broad strokes that are kind of true across, all allied decks. And maybe I guess maybe a little bit of a sidetrack. Would these sort of apply to, I guess, a little bit of the non-standard allied decks, like you mentioned before, Nocturne decks, or even decks that don't really have the game plan is not really having printed allies on the table, things like Kazar's Diary or Spell of Life decks. Would these sort of I guess tips be relevant to them as ally? Would you, I guess the main question is, would you consider them ally decks and then have these tips sort of apply to them, or are they kind of slightly same but different enough that they probably play slightly different?
Well, if you look at like you mentioned Spell of Life and Kazar's Diary, and I think for these two examples specifically, game plan is pretty much very similar to everything that we've gone through, because it's all about getting to a certain point, following which you can get to the point you pretty much are going to steamroll. So it is same in that essence. The only difference is that for those two decks you don't bring out printed allies, but they Spell of Life or the Diary, and that's where you get your allies from later on. So yes, I would consider them ally decks, but you would have some slight variation. For Nocturne, for example, most for Nocturnes you will go forward. You know that they only last one turn, so you have to bleed, or you have to do something that damages prey, or barring that, you have to at least use them to block. Otherwise, it's wasted. So I guess the way that you think when playing a Nocturne deck is slightly different. Similarly, for let's say like animated corps, that they only last for a number of turns. It would be kind of different to if you're playing a deck, like for example, like the Fundus. Very hard to remove people, and that you can count on them being around for quite some time. You can use them to go forward, you keep some up for defense, and so on. And likewise, Shining Quartz, for example, can't bleed. And that means that you're kind of limited to using them in a support role. Either slow down your predator or beat up your prey, leaving your vampires open off and leave the house. So some decks, the allies can do the job for you. House, for example, couriers, for example, Emerald Legionnaires, or even Tunnel Runners. In others, Woggle, Magicians, you will need vampires to still finish up the job. Unless you go down other routes like Fame. Yeah, that's a whole new other video on this.
That is true. That is. I don't know whether there's going to be enough to say about ally combat decks specifically, but yeah, that is a good point. It's probably a much larger topic than we're going to be able to cover today without spending the next another half an hour talking about. So yeah, I think in summary, and correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, correct? So in summary, I guess allies are a powerful archetype that requires time to set up, but once you sort of are at a comfortable position, you can reliably, or at least be in a good position to steamroll the table and sometimes potentially even sweep it. But it also kind of takes time to set up and can be fairly vulnerable as you're setting up. Because of you need to take actions to put allies into play. You need to spend blood on the allies, and at the same time, having it's a mix here. I think sometimes having certain allies on the table, or even just playing your 4th or 5th ally and having like a 7 or 8 minion support will generate table hate and screams of arc enemy, table threat, or whatever it is. So you probably have to think about keeping a low profile and be prepared that sometimes it's just you against the world.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. So I would say that not for everyone, but if you're up for a unique experience, something that all vampire decks can't give you, yeah, give it a try someday. Give an ally deck a spin, and you may find yourself like pleasantly surprised at how well they can do.
Yep, and I think with that, we've come to the end of this podcast. Thank you, Keith, once again for coming on and sharing your thoughts and your extensive experience with building and running ally decks.
A pleasure.
Yeah,
Honored to be here.
and you viewers at home, we hope you found this podcast useful. And if you liked the video, do remember to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and also put a comment below. Do you want to see Keith play a ally deck on the next Shell Games? Have you tried an ally deck and found that it's the same or different from what we've talked about? Let us know in the comments below. And also, if you think there's anything else at all, feel free to drop that in comments as well. I'm saying comments a lot, aren't I? Anyway, yeah, once again, thank you, Keith. And until next time, see ya.